Badil. First of all, thank you for having this conversation here at SEED Lab. I think that the questions that you have asked has been amazing questions. But one thing that I was wondering about is, I come from the north of Norway, so that kind of circumpolar approach of knowledge and the indigenous component of that as being so strong in those communities. How much can we see of that kind of circumpolar sharing of knowledge among the indigenous communities that we are a part of?
Yeah, that's a good question. And Alice probably knows this way better than I do, but my sense is that now that's a pretty active, like through all sorts of different fora, from the kind of the most bureaucratic kind of Arctic Council level, having at least space for, if not actual political representation of Native communities, to kind of more informal, like things that happen on the internet kind of communities that allow for communication across those spaces. And obviously that's not a new thing. People have been moving goods and ideas and stories and people around the circumpolar world for a very, very long time. It just gets to happen a little faster now that I can watch somebody's YouTube in Finland. But yeah, I mean, that's my sense, is that it's actually a pretty vibrant space, both in terms of the kind of cultural currents that are moving, music and artwork around, that's really dynamic. And I know that the folks that I know on the Russian side of the Bering Strait really appreciate that, because it can be really difficult to get some of that material in Russia otherwise. Chukotka is really far from everywhere else in a way that makes Alaska look like it's on a superhighway, just because of how the transit works. So social media and the capacity to see what Sami are doing, to see what Inuit are doing, to see what Inupiaq and Yupik people are doing on this side of the Bering Strait is something that people are really grateful for, because it's really hard to get a visa and do it in person.
Yeah, I think that's true, because once our countries were delineated on us, really, it did create some sorts of division, I would say, right? I didn't, just like Jackie, who's on my episode 4, Eskimo versus Inuit, she was talking about, she didn't even know that there were people that look like us and sound like us and, across the world,
right?
In the circumpolar north, until she was in like high school or college, and that's unfortunate. It shouldn't be that way. We should know that there are these things that bring us together, this way of life, this climate, this, even culture, really. It's a different life to live above the Arctic Circle, but it is, like you said, I think that is a hopeful thing, that we have the globalization of the internet. And, and it's kind of bonkers to me that I haven't even thought of really connecting with somebody from the Russian, just across the Bering Strait. Like, it's so close to us, it's closer than probably, Juneau or something like that.
Yes.
And we don't even have I haven't had any conversations with it. It just makes me re-examine my own connections to people. Right. And so I think that it's always been happening. I just spoke with Ann Jensen, who's an archaeologist in Barrow. And she was telling us the trade, like there was a little jewel that she had found in a piece of wood that's super duper old. And the only way that it could have gotten there was by trade, which just goes to show, like, we weren't isolated up there. We had trade routes. We had communications with folks from all over. So yes, it's always been happening, but it's kind of cool now that there's a globalization. Did you have something to add?
Yeah. I just wanted to say I thought that was interesting that you asked that question. I was actually invited to a Arctic coastal adaptation knowledge exchange across borders in Sweden, and the goal is to exactly do what you're talking about. Maybe not more from like an institutionalized standpoint rather than necessarily Native communities, but. I mean, so there are efforts to see, okay, what are other people doing, and how can we inform each other and help each other? I think that was.
And that's in terms of research?
Mm-hmm. They are inviting, research experts, stakeholders, people who just live in the Arctic, as well as Indigenous people. I mean, so I was a candidate to be able to go. Yeah.
I think that is one of the things that really creates hope in my mind, is actually that that collaboration happens on so many different levels. It's not only, as you say, it's not only institutional, it's people to people. And it's on the level of science, it's a level of art, it's on just the story sharing, etc. And to understand that kind of complexity of how we share also kind of adds maybe an understanding that gives us a richer approach when we dive into maybe the depth of one of those. So I'm very hopeful when it comes to the way and the knowledge bases that are in the circumpolar areas and the way people meet each other for that sharing.
Yeah, it seems like you would have more creative approaches, if you can get everyone from all walks of life, all institutions to come together, put their heads together. Yeah. Well, anything else? Anybody else? Lisa?
Been trying to put together a question over the last few weeks that I don't even know if I can put it into words, but I heard you talking about connection, and I heard you respond, and I thought about that through the course of the book and knowing a little bit about your history, and I related to it, and I guess I wanted just maybe to acknowledge that, and I don't know if you have a response, but that deep change that occurs coming from maybe a largely white and educated community, or that culture in the lower 48, and moving to a place where that connection with the land is inextricable from everything. That is your community and that way of being and thinking, that you had to go through that cultural transition, and how deeply that affects you as an individual, of course, but you in relation to the world there and your relation to the home that you grew up in, and now that you're a professor and you're teaching and you have your family, that there's that interface, and how that huge gift, like how do we convey that? How do we convey that beyond the damage of settler colonialism? There's this gift in this way of life that we've missed, and that is a gift of hopefully coming in with a different way of being, like not coming in to take or to say what to do, but when we come in and we are, as an outsider, this is why you can edit all this out, because I'm like fumbling over my words, just like that's the gift that I keep thinking about and struggling with, like there's so much that we've missed. The settler colonialism, white people coming into communities and saying how it should be, and they've missed it. And then when we go in and just be and learn, it's so humbling. So anyway, thanks.
Yeah. I think one thing kind of related to that comment that I think is heartening is the way in which people who are, and I know this mostly from the book publishing world, because that's the waters I have been swimming in recently. But if you're writing stories, be they fiction or nonfiction or poetry, that are trying to find a way to use the English language to articulate a set of relationships with the world that are broader, that include whales or include trees, or include the underground world, that there is such an appetite for those, that people want to read them. And it's an appetite that I think is particularly pronounced for people that are roughly in their 30s and younger. Like, that's the thing that my students want more of. They want tools to think with, essentially, that kind of allow for some sort of escape from just seeing the world as kind of humans on one side, nature on the other. And I think you can look at the success of, like, Richard Powers' novel, The Overstory, which is in its gazillionth printing, and everyone has read, it seems. And he's telling a story that's really about the way that trees are social beings with people. And that's the reason that book has taken off. And there are some other examples of that I think speak to a real hunger for it and a real desire for people to, who don't come from communities that necessarily have those ties, to think their way into having them. And I don't think it's an easy project or a straightforward one. But I think that's a change that's happened pretty recently, actually. Richard Powers has actually told me this. He's like, if I wrote this book 10 years ago, I don't think people were thinking about trees like this. And all of a sudden, everybody wants to think about trees as, kind of sentient communal beings that we need to find a way of including space for. So I feel like that's good news.
Yeah. I think that I had a conversation with Megan Alvana Stimfel on one of my episodes too, and I forgot what we were talking about, but I was explaining to her that there are some things, and it might be just the connection to place, that I was having a hard time describing to someone, but there's just like deep feelings about it, and it's like, how come I can't express those feelings? Why? And it might be that it's the English language doesn't cater to that kind of language, so that if I had learned my traditional language, Inupiaq, then maybe I might be able to actually express those feelings, which I thought was really interesting, I was like, well, maybe I need to learn. Not maybe. I definitely need to learn my language,
Yeah, I think English has some real, it has some real strengths in that it's a sort of a giant, capacious language that has too many words, but I think about this all the time, and you've heard me in the course of this podcast, like using these terrible workarounds to talk about animals in a way that doesn't turn them into objects. And we can say things like non-human being, not a very elegant phrase. And it also starts with a negation, which I don't love. You can say other than human beings, which is just too long for everyday speech by half. Like you can say animal, but that usually comes with an implied binary of human on the other side. There's not a good term for the way of understanding all sorts of beings as sentient and filled with agency out there, that other languages just do because they use verbs differently or have different nouns for things. So I feel like I'm sort of constantly sort of pushing against that with the language that I have to write in, because it's the one that I know how to write in. And I think other languages do it better.
Okay. Well, cool. Well, thank you so much for being here.
You.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you for having us. I appreciate that. And thank you all for coming.
Really just thank you.
Okay. Well, Coffee and Clock over and out. Coffee and Quack is a podcast I created to celebrate and explore contemporary Native life in urban Alaska. It is an unpaid effort provided by me, your podcast host, and whichever friends or family members I could convince into free labor. All content, contributors, time, and equipment have been donated or paid for out of pocket. If you would like to help support the messages that Coffee and Quack delivers, consider becoming a financial donor through our Patreon page. Thank you to our current individual supporters. Koyanakbak, you are the patek to our bones, the berries to our akutuk, and the zing to our mikiyak. And music for this episode was created by Jesse Darling. Shout out to Jesse Darling! The coffee for this episode was provided by AK Coffee Company. Thank you for keeping me caffeinated. Work hard, play hard, and rest well. Cheers, folks. I'm Alice Kaniklen. Over and out.